When the first group of German POWs arrived at a U.S. military camp in 1944, they walked with stiff posture and quiet arrogance. Their uniforms were worn, but their pride remained untouched. Even though they had been captured, many of them still believed the stories they were told, that Americans were undisciplined, soft, and living on weak rations barely fit for soldiers. As they marched past the American mess hall for the first time, a few of them scoffed. One prisoner, Feldwebel Karl Beckman, whispered just loud enough for others to hear. "So this is where they feed their troops? I doubt there is anything more than watery soup and stale bread." Several POWs chuckled, trying to hold on to any shred of superiority they could find. They were lined up, counted, briefed on camp rules, and then escorted to the mess hall for their first meal. Some expected humiliation. Others expected starvation. What they did not expect was the smell. Rich, savory aromas drifted from inside. Roasted meat, warm bread, cooked vegetables, and even coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter substitute they had grown used to during the final months of the war. Some German prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. They refused to comment. Inside, they were served trays far more generous than the rations they had received during the later stages of the war back in Europe. Slices of meat, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cornbread, and an apple. Many stared silently, unsure whether this was real or a show. Karl sat quietly, fork in hand, refusing to look impressed. He took a small bite, cautious, as if it were a trick. Then another. By the third bite, he was eating fast, almost desperately, though he tried to maintain his composure. Around him, others who had laughed earlier were now silently consuming every last bit on their trays. A few even glanced at the serving counter again, as if contemplating something unthinkable just minutes before. As they left, one American guard casually remarked, "You boys done? Or should we save room for the next shift?" There was a moment of heavy silence. Then, against everything they had expected to feel, one German prisoner raised his hand awkwardly and asked, "Could we maybe have seconds?" A few guards exchanged surprised looks. Karl felt a mix of shame and relief as another prisoner added softly, "Please." That evening, the camp was quiet, not out of fear, but out of confusion. The arrogance many POWs held on to began to crack. If the American mess hall fed them this well as prisoners, what did U.S. soldiers eat on the front lines? Karl lay on his bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, a troubling question echoing in his mind. What if everything we were told was wrong? The following morning, the German POWs woke earlier than expected. Many couldn't stop thinking about the previous day's meal. Some tried to rationalize it. Maybe the Americans only did it on the first day to make an impression. Maybe it was a psychological tactic to weaken their pride. Karl sat on the edge of his bunk in silence. He had barely slept. The memory of warm gravy and soft cornbread replayed in his mind like a forbidden luxury. Back on the Eastern Front, he had gone days with only thin soup and a single potato. Here, he had eaten better as a prisoner than he had as a soldier. "Today, they'll show us the real treatment," muttered Franz, one of the more skeptical prisoners. Yesterday was a show. But when they were escorted back to the mess hall, the sight was just as shocking as before. Trays were already being prepared, steam rising from fresh eggs, bacon sizzling on metal pans, oats being stirred, bread being sliced, real butter, real jam, and coffee. Always coffee. Some POW's eyes widened despite their efforts to remain indifferent. Karl kept his face expressionless, but his stomach betrayed him with a quiet growl. At the tables, an American soldier distributing breakfast gave them a friendly nod. "Eat up. There's plenty." The words felt surreal. As they ate, the atmosphere was strangely calm. There was no shouting, no humiliation, no mocking from the guards. The Americans watched them, yes, but without hatred. It was unsettling. Then something unexpected happened. A young American private, maybe barely 20, passed by and dropped a folded newspaper onto a nearby table before stepping away. The headline was in English, but one German, Heinrich, understood enough to translate in a nervous whisper. It talked about Allied victories, growing industrial power, and how American production was overwhelming the Axis. Photos showed assembly lines full of machines and food supplies stacked in warehouses. One prisoner clenched his fist tightly. "Is this true?" someone murmured. Carl stared at the photos. U.S. soldiers smiling with overflowing ration packs. A cold realization crept into the room like a quiet storm. They had not only lost in battle, they had lost in resources. They had lost in morale. They had lost in belief. That night, as they gathered back in the barracks, the arrogance that had once filled the camp began to fade. There were no more jokes about weak American food or soft enemy soldiers. Instead, a new kind of silence settled in, not one of fear, but of reflection. Franz broke the quiet. If this is how they feed their prisoners, what kind of strength do their men on the battlefield have? No one answered, because for the first time, they were afraid of the truth. And somewhere inside, a small but growing voice whispered in Carl's mind, maybe we were wrong about more than just the food. Over the next few days, the German POWs settled into a quiet routine. Roll call, assigned labor, meals in the mess hall, and time in the barracks. The arrogance that once fueled whispered laughter had slowly dissolved into something more complicated. Silent comparison and uneasy admiration. Carl couldn't ignore it anymore. The American camp was orderly but not cruel. Guards followed rules, spoke firmly but not abusively, and surprisingly, didn't seem driven by hatred. To men who had been told that capture meant torture or starvation, this was unsettling. One afternoon, the POWs were assigned to clear debris near a supply depot. Boxes of food labeled with American military stamps were being offloaded from trucks. Curious eyes couldn't help but track every item. Canned meats, fruits, sugar, milk powder, even chocolate. Chocolate! A wave of disbelief rippled silently through the German ranks. Back home, chocolate had nearly vanished from everyday life years ago. Here, it was casually stacked like any other supply. Nearby, a young American guard named Miller was leaning against a post, eating a chocolate bar with no sense of urgency. He noticed the stares. Carl quickly averted his gaze, pretending not to care. But another POW, Dieter, always quick to joke to hide discomfort, muttered quietly, "Imagine being captured just to watch them eat chocolate in front of us." A few nervous chuckles escaped. Not arrogant laughter, like before, but weary, almost embarrassed. Suddenly, Miller approached. The prisoners tensed slightly. He stopped beside them, glanced at their curious eyes, then reached into his pocket. To their shock, he broke the remaining half of his chocolate bar into 3 small pieces and tossed them onto a nearby crate. Not directly at them, but within reach. "Don't say I never shared," he said with a half-smile before walking away. For a moment, no one moved. It wasn't charity forced on them. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't a trick. It was human. Carl hesitated, but curiosity won. He reached out, picked up a piece carefully, as though it might vanish. He placed it gently on his tongue. Rich sweetness spread across his mouth. Memories of peacetime flickered. His mother buying him a chocolate bar once a year on his birthday as a child. He closed his eyes for a second longer than necessary. When he opened them, he saw something he didn't expect, not just from himself, but from the men around him. Guilt. Guilt for mocking. Guilt for judging without knowing. Guilt for dehumanizing people who now treated them better than they expected. That night, Carl lay awake again, but not from hunger this time. He stared at the ceiling and wondered, if our enemies can show us decency, what does that say about everything we believed? Outside, in the quiet of the camp, the American flag fluttered gently in the wind. For the first time, Carl didn't look away. The next morning, the atmosphere among the POWs felt different. They still walked in formation, still kept discipline, but something inward had shifted. Their steps were quieter, their faces less defiant. Whispers, once full of mockery, now carried uncertainty, even quiet respect. Carl noticed it in himself, too. When he stepped into the mess hall that day, he did not look with suspicion, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the men behind the counter who prepared their meals. He didn't understand why, but he felt a strange pull toward understanding these soldiers, these Americans who, despite being victorious, did not gloat. Later that afternoon, Carl and a few others were tasked with stacking lumber near a fenced section of the camp. Guard duty had rotated, and once again, Private Miller was assigned to watch over them. The young American leaned casually against a post, humming to himself as the prisoners worked. At one point, Dieter, still the most talkative of the group, lost his grip and dropped a plank. Miller glanced over with a faint smirk. "Careful," he said lightly. "Don't break it. We still need you boys useful." The tone wasn't cruel, more like friendly teasing. Dieter gave a half-smile, despite himself. Eventually, work slowed, and the tension loosened slightly. Carl, feeling a pull he couldn't fully explain, dared to speak. "You gave us chocolate yesterday," he said in slow, careful English. Miller glanced over. "Yeah, figured you might miss it." Carl hesitated. "Why?" Miller shrugged. "I dunno. You're prisoners, not animals." Silence followed. The words sank deep into the German soldiers' minds. Miller then added, "War's war. But here it's different. Orders say treat you fair. And, honestly, he kicked a stone idly. Seems right." Carl exchanged a look with Franz. Franz whispered in German, quiet enough that only their group could hear. "They don't hate us, even after everything." As the shift ended, Miller called out, "Work done. Mess hall have stew tonight. It's good stuff. Better than yesterday." Some POWs almost visibly reacted. Better than yesterday? As they walked back, Carl noticed Franz staring at the ground, brows furrowed. "What's wrong?" Carl asked. Franz hesitated. His voice was low. "I don't know what to feel anymore. That night, the stew was better. Rich? Thick, filled with meat and vegetables." Some prisoners even talked quietly while eating, their eyes softer, their expressions less hardened. Carl sat quietly, spoon in hand, reflecting. He had marched into this camp believing that capture would be the worst shame of his life. Instead, it was slowly becoming something else. A mirror, forcing him to question not his surrender, but his former beliefs. Lying on his bunk later, Carl's thoughts were heavy but clearer than before. We were told they were soulless. We were told they were cruel. We were told we were better. But what if we were told wrong? Outside, a faint sound of laughter drifted from a group of American guards sharing a cigarette. Not mocking, not cruel, just human. For the first time, Carl felt something unexpected. Not fear, not shame, but a quiet pull toward understanding the people he'd been taught to hate. The shift in the German camp was subtle, but real. The soldiers no longer entered the mess hall with stiff pride or suspicious eyes. They still held their discipline. But now, meals were accompanied by quiet reflection rather than arrogant silence. Conversations began to change. Instead of mocking the Americans, the POWs exchanged uncertain questions. "Do you think all their soldiers eat like this? Is this why they never run out of strength? Could this be why we lost?" Carl didn't always answer, but he listened. That afternoon, the same group, Carl, Franz, Dieter, and two others, were once again assigned to Miller's watch. By now, the young American guard was familiar to them. He had a relaxed manner, hands usually in his pockets, rifle slung casually rather than aggressively. He whistled a tune as they worked, something upbeat and foreign to their ears. At one point, Dieter, wiping sweat from his forehead, asked quietly in German, "What is that song?" Carl hesitated, but then surprised even himself by speaking in English, however broken. "The song you whistle, what is name?" Miller paused mid-hum and chuckled. "This? Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. Popular back home." Dieter blinked. "Boogie Woogie?" Miller laughed a little. "Yeah, jazz. Makes you want to move." Franz scoffed softly under his breath, but not with contempt, more with cultural confusion. Carl didn't laugh. Instead, he asked, "Do you like being soldier?" Miller fell quiet for a moment. His expression shifted, not sad, but thoughtful. "Not sure like is the right word," he said eventually. "I do my duty, same as you did yours, I guess." He didn't say it with accusation. Carl nodded slowly. That answer felt honest. Miller then tilted his head. "You miss home." Silence again. The Germans weren't used to American guards asking them anything personal. Dieter answered quietly, My sister. She was 14 last time I saw her. Miller nodded. I got a little brother. 12. Keeps sending me drawings. The POWs were quiet. They didn't know what to do with the feeling now forming between them. Something dangerously close to understanding. Then, unexpectedly, Miller said, "When the war's over, what will you do?" It was a simple question, but it landed heavily. Franz replied first, but without his usual sarcasm. "If my town is still standing, I will rebuild my father's workshop." Carl took a while before answering. "I do not know. Maybe find work. Start again." Miller nodded quietly. "Everyone's going to need to start again after this." His words lingered like a gentle echo. Work resumed, but the silence that followed wasn't cold or tense. It was shared. Human. Later that evening in the barracks, Franz looked over at Carl with a conflicted expression. "Do you think it is wrong," he asked softly, "to feel grateful to the enemy?" Carl stared up at the wooden beams above him. His answer wasn't immediate. Finally, he replied, not in arrogance but in quiet truth. "I'm starting to wonder if they were really the enemy, or if we just didn't know them." No one responded, but no one disagreed. In the days that followed, the German camp experienced a quiet division, not enforced by guards, but born from within. Some prisoners, like Carl and Dieter, had begun to accept that the Americans were not the villains they had been told to expect. They ate their meals without mockery, spoke cautiously to guards, and worked with a strange sense of calm. But not everyone welcomed this shift. Friedrich Fritz Hahn, a stubborn sergeant hardened by propaganda and battlefield losses, refused to accept the changes. Each evening, he would sit with a small group of loyalists in the far corner of the barracks, muttering bitter words. "They fatten us up like livestock," he scoffed one night. "Do not mistake this hospitality for kindness. They want us compliant. Weak." A few nodded. Others looked unconvinced, but fear of being judged kept them silent. Carl, seated across the room, overheard the whispers. He didn't respond. He didn't argue, but something felt heavy in his chest, a conflict he couldn't ignore. Later, as he lay on his bunk, Fritz's words echoed in his mind. Were they being manipulated? Was kindness just another weapon? The next day, during work duty, Carl watched Miller casually chatting with another American guard, both laughing at some shared joke. There was no hint of cruelty or calculated manipulation, just normal young men. As the shift ended, Miller sat on a crate near the fence and glanced toward Carl and his group. "Hey," he said, tapping his boot lightly. "You guys ever go fishing back home?" The question was odd, sudden, almost random, but it disarmed them. Dieter shrugged. "My uncle had a small boat on a lake," he said slowly. Miller smiled faintly. "Me and my brother used to fish near a river. He'd always fall in," he chuckled quietly. Mom would yell. The Germans listened in silence. The image was simple, peaceful, almost painful. Franz asked, "Is your brother safe?" Miller nodded. "He's home, too young for war." Carl hesitated, then asked softly, "Why are you here then?" Miller paused, not offended, just thoughtful. "Because if I'm here, maybe it won't have to be," he said quietly. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but deeply human. For a moment, there was no POW in guard, no victor and captive, no opposing flags, just brothers, sons, men who wanted to go home to quiet mornings and fishing trips that didn't end in fear. That evening in the barracks, Dieter whispered, "Do you still think they're pretending?" Carl shook his head. "No, I think this is who they are." Across the room, Fritz's small group whispered their bitterness into the darkness. But their words were starting to sound weaker, less convincing, like echoes of a collapsing truth. Carl lay awake, staring into the shadows, and felt something new growing inside him. Not defeat, not shame, but the first fragile spark of understanding, which terrified him and comforted him all at once. The tension within the barracks deepened like a quiet crack spreading through wood. It didn't explode. It grew, silently, becoming harder to ignore. Carl felt it every time he accepted his meal without hesitation. Every time he exchanged even a few words with Miller. Every time he allowed himself a moment of calm. something Fritz and his loyalists interpreted as weakness. One cold evening, after mess hall dinner, whispers turned to confrontation. Carl was sitting at his bunk, quietly folding his shirt after laundry duty, when Fritz approached with 2 men at his side. His boots stopped just inches from Carl's bed. "You're getting comfortable," Fritz said coldly. Carl looked up slowly. His expression remained steady. "We are adapting," he replied carefully. "That is how we endure." Fritz scoffed. "Endure? You mean obey. You mean bow. You eat their food like a tame dog." Several POWs glanced over, silent, uneasy. Carl didn't rise. "I eat because I am hungry, because I am alive. That does not make me a dog." Fritz stepped closer, his voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. "You talk to them. You smile when they treat you kindly. You're forgetting who we are." Carl met his stare. His heartbeat quickened, but his voice remained calm. "Who are we now, Fritz? Soldiers without a battlefield. Prisoners in a war that is already turning against us. We are not traitors for acknowledging reality." Franz stood from his bunk, watching tensely. Dieter shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene. Fritz's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Men like you break morale. You infect others with softness." Carl stood now, quietly but firmly. They were nearly face to face. "I am not becoming soft," he said. "I am becoming honest." A cold silence fell over the room. For a moment, it seemed Fritz might strike him, his jaw clenched, breath heavy. But instead, he spat at Carl's feet. "When this is over," Fritz muttered, "we will see who walks out with honor and who walks out ashamed." He turned sharply and walked away. His loyalists followed, though one glanced back at Carl with uncertainty. As the barracks quieted, Carl sat back down, his pulse slowly steadying. Franz sat beside him wordlessly. After a moment, Dieter asked softly, "Are you afraid of him?" Carl exhaled. "I am not afraid of Fritz. I am afraid of what happens to men who cling to hate when the war is already ending." A heavy silence filled the room. Later that night, as Carl lay on his bunk, he heard faint weeping somewhere in the darkness. Not from fear, but from men who didn't know what they believed anymore. Outside, distant searchlights swept the night sky. Somewhere far beyond the fence, the world continued moving toward an uncertain future. And for the first time, Carl wondered not just when he would return home, but who he would be when he did, and a bitter wind swept across the camp the next morning, rattling loose tin sheets and sending dust swirling across the yard. The routine remained unchanged, roll call, morning labor assignments, but the mood felt different, tense, expectant, as if whispers of a storm had reached them before the thunder. That afternoon, as the POWs worked along the fence repairing storage crates, Miller arrived later than usual. His expression wasn't relaxed. Gone was the casual whistle. His jaw was clenched, and his steps were heavier. Carl noticed first. When Miller finally stopped near the wooden barrier, he didn't immediately speak. Instead, he sat down slowly, resting his rifle beside him. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee, a nervous habit, Carl guessed. The Germans paused their work, sensing something unusual. Franz exchanged a glance with Dieter. Finally, Miller looked up at them. "There's news," he said quietly. The prisoners froze. Miller hesitated, searching for the right words. "Paris is free," he said. The Allies took it back. For a moment, no one reacted. The information hung in the air like a suspended blade. Then it sank in. Paris free. Carl's hammer slipped from his hand, striking the ground with a dull thud. Dieter's mouth parted slightly in disbelief. Franz muttered, "No, it can't." Even Fritz's distant loyalists, working under another guard, paused mid-task. Miller continued, "They're pushing forward faster than expected. A lot of POWs are coming in from the Western Front. War's changing." The German prisoners stood in stunned silence. The reality they had tried to deny was now undeniable. One of the quieter POWs whispered shakily, "If Paris is gone, then..." Carl finished the thought in his mind, but could not speak it aloud. "Then everything we fought for is collapsing." Miller watched their reactions carefully. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't triumphant. In fact, he looked almost sad. Slowly, Carl approached him, cautious but resolute. "What will happen now?" he asked, voice heavy. Miller really looked at him, and then he said something Carl would never forget. "That depends on what you choose to do with what's left of yourselves." Carl blinked, caught off guard. Miller continued, voice low but firm. "War doesn't just end when the guns go quiet. It ends when men decide who they're going to be afterward." Carl stood silently, struck by the weight of the words. Behind him, the other POWs listened, some uncertain, others shaken, and a few, like Fritz, glaring with clenched fists. Miller stood up, lifting his rifle. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer judgment. Just one final sentence before walking back toward the guard post. "Just make sure when you go home someday, you're proud of the man who walks through that door." That evening, the barracks were quieter than they had ever been. No mockery, no forced bravado, no loud arguments. Just men staring into nothing, thinking not of battles already fought, but of the men they might become when the war was over. Carl sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. Paris was gone. The war was shifting. And so was he. The air inside the barracks that night felt heavier than ever. News of Paris had struck the camp like a silent shell. No explosion, no smoke, but a deep rupture in morale. Some prisoners lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Others sat hunched on their bunks, heads in hands. A few whispered prayers they hadn't spoken in years. But not everyone was quiet. At the far end of the barracks, Fritz had gathered his loyalists like a last desperate ember fighting the wind. His voice was a low, harsh whisper, brimming with anger. "They want us to believe it's over," he snarled. "They want us to surrender not just our weapons, but our pride, our identity." One of the younger prisoners, Otto, looked nervous. "But Fritz, if Paris is gone, maybe..." "Maybe what?" Fritz hissed. "Maybe we should thank them for feeding us? Maybe we should forget our fallen comrades and pretend we were wrong to fight." "Silence." Fritz leaned forward, his eyes burning. "Don't forget who you are just because they serve warm stew," he growled. "A soldier who surrenders his pride is worse than a man who dies with honor." Across the room, Carl could hear every word. Franz sat beside him, arms crossed, deep in thought. Dieter, now visibly conflicted, shifted uneasily. Carl's mind echoed with Miller's voice. "Make sure when you go home someday, you're proud of the man who walks through that door." Pride. Fritz spoke of pride like a weapon. Miller spoke of pride like a future. Fritz finished with a warning. "If any man in this barracks tries to shame us by crawling to the Americans, remember, we are soldiers first. Soldiers don't bend. Soldiers don't thank the enemy." His followers nodded, though some with more doubt than conviction. The line had been drawn. Later, as the camp lights dimmed and quiet swallowed the barracks, Franz broke the silence near Carl. "Do you think he's right?" Franz asked softly, not looking up. Carl didn't answer immediately. He thought of his childhood, his mother's laughter, his father's worn hands after long hours in the workshop. He thought of joining the army, proud and sure that he was fighting for strength, glory, a cause greater than himself. But now that cause felt distant, broken, replaced by something new and deeply personal. "I think," Carl said slowly, "a soldier who refuses to change may win pride in the moment, but lose his soul in the end." Franz looked at him. His eyes were tired, but something in him eased. Dieter finally spoke, voice shaky. "Do you think we've already lost our souls?" Carl looked toward Fritz's corner, where anger tried to hold itself together in a crumbling world. "No," he said quietly. "Only if we let hate decide who we become next." The three men sat in silence, the weight of the world pressing on them. In the shadows, some listened, unsure which future to follow. Outside, searchlight beams swept across the night sky, like silent questions tracing lines across the darkness. And deep down, Carl understood, there was no going back to who they were before, only forward. But which direction would be decided soon. The following morning, the tension that had been quietly simmering inside the barracks began to seep into the camp's daily routine. During roll call, guards noticed fewer conversations among the POWs. Franz avoided certain men, Dieter kept glancing nervously toward Fritz's group, who now stood in a tight formation, more rigid than before, eyes cold, jaws tense. Even the way they marched seemed sharper, fueled not by discipline, but defiance. Carl felt it too. Every step toward the work area felt heavier. That afternoon, the POWs were assigned to repair wooden pallets and move supply crates. Miller, now a familiar presence, watched as always. But today, Carl saw something different in the guard's gaze. Awareness. Miller wasn't smiling. He scanned the group like someone who could feel something was about to break. The work began. Carl and Franz lifted crates together in silence. Nearby, Dieter hesitated before joining them, clearly torn. Fritz worked farther down the line with Otto and two other hardliners. Occasionally, Fritz's stare would cut across the yard like a blade, landing on Carl with unspoken accusation. When Dieter accidentally dropped a plank, Carl bent to pick it up with him, but Fritz muttered just loud enough to be heard. Careful, wouldn't want to break anything for your new friends. Dieter froze. Carl remained calm, lifting the plank without reacting. But Franz stepped forward, his voice low but steady. Enough, Fritz. Fritz turned slowly, his eyes lighting with challenge. Or what? You'll report me for not thanking our captors? Franz stared back, tension growing in every muscle. We're prisoners. We survive. That's it. Stop pretending we're still fighting a glorious war. The moment shattered like glass. Fritz stepped closer. You already surrendered your rifle. Don't surrender your dignity. Franz squared up. Carl moved between them instinctively, not aggressively, just enough to keep them from clashing. You're angry, Carl said steadily. I understand, but turning on each other won't change what happened. Fritz's face twisted with restrained fury. Spare me your wisdom, Beckman. You're no leader. You're a man looking for permission to forgive your enemies. For a moment, it seemed Fritz might shove Carl, but suddenly, a firm American voice cut through the tension. That's enough. Miller. He had stepped forward, rifle in hand, but not raised. His posture wasn't hostile, but undeniably authoritative. The Germans froze. Fritz glared but backed away a half step, jaw set. Miller looked at Carl briefly, eyes filled with quiet concern, almost as if asking silently, "Are you okay?" Carl gave a slight nod. Miller spoke clearly. You're here to work, not to turn this into another battlefield. Understood. The POWs nodded, some reluctantly. Work resumed, but slower, more strained. Everyone felt the aftershock of the confrontation. Later, during a short break, Miller walked over and stopped in front of Carl, speaking quietly so others couldn't hear. You don't have to say anything, Miller said, but if there's trouble, I need to know. Carl hesitated. I don't want more conflict. Miller nodded slowly. Yeah, but sometimes conflict finds you even when you're trying to move on. Carl lowered his eyes, deep in thought. Miller started to walk away, then paused. Just be careful who you let decide what survival means, he said. As he left, Carl looked around at his fellow prisoners, some angry, some afraid, some lost. And he realized Fritz wasn't just fighting the war that had already moved beyond them. He was fighting against a future where hate no longer had control. And that made Fritz dangerous that a few days later, a new group of German POWs arrived at the camp. They were thinner, dirtier, and far more broken than the prisoners already there. Their uniforms were tattered, boots worn to the sole. They moved not like soldiers, but like men carrying invisible weights on their shoulders. Every eye in the camp watched as they were processed. Carl noticed something in their expressions. No fire, no arrogance, not even denial, only exhaustion. Later that afternoon, some of the newer prisoners were assigned to join Carl's group in stacking lumber. One of them, a gaunt man with hollow eyes named Weber, collapsed after lifting only a few planks. Dieter rushed to help him sit down. Miller approached quickly, not with anger, but concern. He knelt beside Weber and called to another guard for water. The German drank slowly, trembling, before whispering through cracked lips, "We thought we'd starve before capture." He looked around at the American supplies, the lumber yard, the sky. Then he whispered something that caused several POWs to freeze. It's over. The front is collapsing from all sides. We lost too much. We can't hold. Fritz, who was working nearby, stiffened. Lies, he snapped. You are weak, tired, but we still stand. Weber looked up slowly, eyes dull but brutally honest. Stand where? Berlin? It's next. They are closing in. A heavy silence fell. He continued, voice cracking. We fought with empty stomachs and broken rifles. You do not understand. There is nothing left to stand on. Fritz's jaw trembled with rage. Stop talking. But Weber didn't stop. Tears filled his eyes. They told us to hold positions that were already lost. They lied to us. Fritz lied while they sat in safety. Men died for speeches. The entire work area went still. Fritz's fists clenched. His breathing became uneven. His world, the last piece of it, was being ripped apart by the words of fellow soldier, not an enemy. He turned away suddenly, shoulders tense, not attacking, but crumbling. Miller watched this unfold with a calm, unreadable expression. Then, without saying a word, he stood, giving the prisoners a moment of dignity, and simply called, "Break time." The men sat quietly. No one looked at Fritz. No one mocked him. No one comforted him, because they all understood the war was still raging far away. But here, inside this camp, it had just ended, not with a bullet, not with a victory march, but with acceptance. That evening, the barracks were quieter than ever. No whispers of hatred, no speeches of pride, no more talk of shame or betrayal, only silent reflection. Carl sat on his bunk, staring at the wooden floor. Across the room, Fritz sat alone, eyes empty, no longer preaching, just existing, trying to understand who he was now that the war had taken everything, even his certainty. Carl thought of Miller's words. Make sure when you go home someday, you're proud of the man who walks through that door. He looked at his hands, rough and worn, but no longer trembling with anger. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know when he would go home. But he knew this. When the war outside ended, he would not carry a new war inside him. He would rebuild. He would remember those lost. And he would choose not hatred, but humanity. Outside, beyond the fences, the world was changing. And inside, so were they,